A sitting U.S. president told the leader of one of America's closest allies, in public, with the whole world watching, that his country only exists because of the United States. What happened next, nobody in Washington saw coming. The setup. There's a particular kind of political humiliation that isn't delivered with guns or sanctions. It comes dressed as an invitation. For weeks, Donald Trump had been building excitement around something he called the Board of Peace, a new global council of leaders, personally assembled by him, designed to reshape how the world's most powerful nations cooperate. He described it in his signature style, the most prestigious board ever assembled. Historic, unprecedented, a personal achievement that would leave a mark on global history. Invitations went out. Some leaders expressed interest, and for a brief moment it looked like the idea had a pulse. But behind closed doors, something very different was happening. Foreign ministries across Europe and North America were reading the invitation carefully and quietly deciding they wanted no part of it. Canada, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, not rivals, not enemies, America's own allies. One by one, they declined. Here's what makes this fascinating. Nobody made a dramatic announcement. Nobody called a press conference. The refusals came the way diplomatic resistance usually does, through delays, through ambiguity, through the kind of silence that carries its own message. And as the rejections accumulated, the board that was supposed to reshape the world order hadn't held a single meeting, cast a single vote, or even officially come into existence. It was collapsing before it began. And rather than acknowledge the refusals, Trump did something that tells you everything about how this confrontation was going to unfold. He began withdrawing the invitations himself, publicly, on his own terms, rewriting the story in real time. You didn't turn me down. I showed you the door. The letter that changed the conversation. The moment everything came into focus was a single published message addressed to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Short, precise, delivered with the cold formality of someone who wants the last word more than they want a real conversation. Dear Prime Minister Carney, please let this letter serve to represent that the Board of Peace is withdrawing its invitation to you regarding Canada's joining what will be the most prestigious board of leaders ever assembled at any time. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Read that again. No explanation, no reference to what had changed, no diplomatic courtesy beyond the bare minimum. Just a door closing, with a note slid underneath it. Within hours, journalists on both sides of the border were asking the same question. Not what happened. The tension had been building for days. The real question was, why this week? What pushed this particular confrontation into the open right now? To understand that, you have to look at what Carney had been doing in the days before that letter arrived. Carney in Beijing, and what it really meant. 1 week earlier, Carney had wrapped up a visit to China that, on the surface, looked like a standard trade mission. He met with Xi Jinping. They reached an agreement to lower trade barriers between Canada and China. Routine, right? Not quite. The context surrounding that deal transformed its meaning entirely. For over a year, Canada had been living with something deeply uncomfortable, a trade relationship with its southern neighbor that had grown increasingly unpredictable. Tariff threats, demands for renegotiation, the language of dependency being used not to describe a partnership but to establish a hierarchy. Against that backdrop, Carney's Beijing visit was a strategic signal. Canada was serious about building what officials were calling an East-West trade pivot, a deliberate effort to develop commercial relationships that would reduce the country's vulnerability to disruption from any single partner, no matter how close that partner had historically been. This is, for the record, standard practice for virtually every sophisticated medium-sized economy in the world. The European Union has spent decades building trade networks across Asia and Africa precisely to avoid the vulnerability that comes with excessive dependence on any single relationship. Japan, South Korea, Australia, All have invested in trade diversification as core economic doctrine. Canada doing the same was not a provocation. It was prudence. But in Washington, prudence that reduces American leverage tends to look like provocation anyway. And what happened next made that tension impossible to ignore. Every January, the world's political and financial elite gathers in Davos, Switzerland, for the World Economic Forum. It's a gathering that gets mocked for its insularity, and, honestly, some of that mockery is fair. But it is also a stage where what is said actually lands, where the audience includes finance ministers, central bank governors, and heads of state who are listening for real signals about where the world is heading. Carney stepped onto that stage and said something the room wasn't fully expecting. He began by making a claim that was historically framed but felt urgently contemporary. The rules-based international order, that framework of multilateral institutions and shared norms that has structured global relations since the end of the Second World War, was not, he argued, functioning as advertised. Stop invoking the rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised, he said. Call the system what it is, a period where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as a weapon of coercion. The room went quiet. He spoke about tariffs being used as leverage rather than genuine economic instruments. He described financial infrastructure being deployed as coercion. He called on what he termed middle powers, countries too large to dismiss but too small to project unilateral force, to build stronger coalitions, to diversify their relationships, and to stop accepting the premise that the most powerful nation automatically sets the rules for everyone else. He did not mention Trump by name. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew exactly who he was describing and exactly which policies he had in mind. The response was extraordinary. Carney received a standing ovation, a genuinely rare reaction at Davos, where audiences tend toward polite, restrained acknowledgement. The speech traveled immediately through diplomatic circles, through financial newsrooms, and through government briefing rooms across Europe and Asia. This was not background noise. This was a declaration, and it was about to get a very direct response. Less than 24 hours later, speaking at Davos via video link, Trump addressed the forum in his characteristically expansive style. He touched on American economic strength. He mentioned his proposed Golden Dome missile defense system and noted pointedly that its coverage would extend over Canadian airspace too. Not as an offer, as a reminder. Then came the lines that stopped people mid-sentence. Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. Pause. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark? The use of the first name was deliberate. This wasn't President to Prime Minister communication with the usual diplomatic distance. It was personal. It was dominance presented as geopolitical fact. And by reducing a 157-year-old sovereign nation to something that lives because of its larger neighbor, Trump was making an argument that went well beyond trade policy. He was asserting ownership. Within hours, not days, hours, the Board of Peace withdrawal letter appeared in public. The sequence couldn't have been clearer. Carney challenges American power on the world's most prominent economic stage. Trump watches. Trump responds. The invitation disappears. The message was as explicit as it gets. Challenge me publicly. And this is the price. Before we get to Carney's response, it's worth pausing on Trump's claim directly. Because buried inside Canada lives because of the United States is an assumption that deserves to be examined against the actual historical record. Canada and the United States trade roughly $900 billion in goods and services every year, making them each other's largest trading partners. The two economies are deeply interwoven, particularly in automotive manufacturing, energy, and financial services. And the American military presence in North America creates a strategic environment from which Canada undeniably benefits. These things are real, Canadian officials don't dispute them. But the claim that Canada owes its existence to American generosity, that's a different argument entirely. Canada and the United States jointly operate the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, a binational structure that has protected North American airspace since 1958. Canadian officers serve at NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs. Canadian radar systems monitor approaches that protect American cities. In 2022, Canada announced a military modernization plan worth $38.6 billion, including a next-generation radar system designed specifically to update NORAD's detection capabilities. Canada is also in active discussions about participating in Trump's own Golden Dome initiative, estimated by Trump at $175 billion, though a Bloomberg analysis puts the realistic cost closer to $1.1 trillion. And then there's the history that doesn't fit neatly into a narrative about Canadian dependency. When the Korean War began, Canada sent troops. When September 11th reshaped American foreign policy and the United States went into Afghanistan, Canada followed. More than 40,000 Canadian servicemen and women deployed over more than a decade. 158 of them did not come home. The idea that the country that made those sacrifices lives because of the United States is not a historical argument. It's an assertion of dominance dressed up as a fact. Carney didn't respond at Davos. He traveled home. And when he spoke, standing in Quebec City ahead of a cabinet meeting, addressing his own country, the measured quality of his reply said as much as the words themselves. He began by acknowledging what is genuinely true. The partnership between Canada and the United States, in trade, in security, in cultural exchange, is real, deep, and worth protecting. He didn't pretend otherwise. He didn't reach for easy nationalism or dramatic grievance. And then he drew the line. But Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. Short, simple, precisely calibrated, not a shout, a correction. He kept going. And what followed wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a larger argument about what this moment means. In a time of rising populism and ethnic nationalism, Canada can show how diversity can be a strength, not a weakness. Canada cannot solve all the world's problems, but we can show that another way is possible, that the arc of history isn't destined to be warped toward authoritarianism and exclusion. It can still bend toward progress and justice. In a room full of political leaders, those words landed. And among Canadians watching at home, living through a moment of genuine national uncertainty, they landed differently still. Because here's the part of this story that doesn't get enough attention. Carney wasn't only managing a confrontation with Washington, he was simultaneously trying to hold his own country together. Canada is a federation of distinct regions with distinct political cultures and, at times, distinct visions of what the country should be. And two of those regions, both among the country's four largest, had been drifting in concerning directions. In Alberta, Canada's energy heartland, a movement toward a sovereignty referendum had been gaining serious momentum. Not a fringe position, an organized, politically sophisticated push for a possible independence vote as early as 2026. In Quebec, the nation's largest French-speaking province with its own long and complex relationship with separatist politics, a sovereigntist party had taken the lead in public opinion polling ahead of upcoming provincial elections. Carney addressed this directly, and the tone shifted. Toward Washington, he was firm and measured. Toward his own country, he was something closer to urgent. When we are united, unity grows. When we are Canadian, inclusive, fair, ambitious, Canada grows. We choose a bright future worthy of the ground on which we stand. We choose Canada. That phrase, "we choose Canada," wasn't just political messaging. It was an acknowledgement that the choice is real, that unity isn't automatic, that people living inside a country can, and sometimes do, decide they'd rather be elsewhere. The external pressure from Washington and the internal pressure from within the Federation were not unconnected. Both were asking the same underlying question: what holds this country together, and is it strong enough? Running beneath all of this, like a frequency most people felt, but few were naming directly, was something that had been disturbing NATO capitals for months. Trump's renewed and persistent push to acquire Greenland. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO member. Greenland itself holds one of the most strategically significant geographic positions in the world, sitting astride Arctic shipping routes that are opening rapidly as climate change transforms the region, and in the path of military approaches that matter enormously to both American and European security planners. Trump had floated the idea of purchasing Greenland during his first term. It was met with disbelief and, honestly, polite dismissal. The Danish government said Greenland wasn't for sale. Greenland's own government said the same. The idea faded, except it hadn't faded from Trump's thinking. It returned, not as an offhand remark, but as something resembling a stated policy preference. And for European governments watching the trajectory of American behavior toward its allies, this was not an abstract curiosity. It was a signal about how the current American administration viewed sovereignty itself, including the sovereignty of close partners. If the world's leading democracy was openly discussing the acquisition of a NATO ally's territory, what exactly did alliance membership still guarantee? That question wasn't just being asked in Copenhagen. It was being asked in Paris, Berlin, Ottawa, and Warsaw. It was the unspoken backdrop to every diplomatic hesitation around the Board of Peace, and it gave Carney's Davos speech a resonance that extended far beyond any single bilateral trade dispute. Step back from the immediate confrontation, the letter, the speech, the exchange of pointed words, and you start to see what this story is actually about. Carney introduced a concept at Davos that had been circulating in policy circles for years, but had rarely received this kind of prominent, public platform. The idea of middle powers as a coherent geopolitical category with its own distinctive obligations. Middle powers are countries that matter, that have substantial economies, real diplomatic reach, active participation in global institutions, but that cannot project force unilaterally the way great powers can. They operate within the international framework rather than setting its terms. And for decades, they did so on the reasonable assumption that the framework was genuinely mutual, that the rules applied to everyone, including the most powerful. What Carney was naming at Davos was the erosion of that assumption. The rules-based international order isn't collapsing because of external pressure from China or Russia alone. It's under pressure from within, from the country that did more than almost any other to build it in the first place. And his argument was, direct middle powers cannot simply wait for the framework to repair itself. They have to make active choices, build alternative economic relationships, coordinate more deliberately with each other. Refuse to accept a version of international partnership that requires submission as its entry fee. Whether that coalition materializes in durable form remains genuinely uncertain. Middle powers have historically struggled to maintain coordination over time. The gravitational pull of great power patronage is always present, always offering something: security guarantees, market access, in exchange for alignment. But the standing ovation Carney received in Davos was a real signal. The appetite for this argument, for someone to name clearly what many had been experiencing but struggling to articulate, is genuine. The Board of Peace never met. The table was never set. The invitations were gone before the initiative ever drew a breath. But in the wreckage of that non-event, something clarifying happened. The terms of the relationship between the United States and its closest allies were stated openly by both sides without diplomatic softening. And the world got to see, without ambiguity, what each side actually believes about the other. Trump's view that American power is the foundation on which allied nations rest. that gratitude is owed upward, and that independence is tolerated only as long as it doesn't inconvenience the powerful. Carney's view that sovereignty is not conditional on proximity to power, that genuine partnership doesn't require submission, and that the arc of history, however it is currently bending, is not fixed. Two visions, one confrontation, and a question that won't be answered by any single speech, any single letter, or any single withdrawn invitation. Who gets to define the rules of the world we share? The answer isn't going to come from Washington alone. It's going to come from the accumulation of choices made by nations that decide they have more to gain from standing for something than from kneeling before someone. Canada made its choice this week, and the rest of the world is watching very carefully to see what it costs. If you stayed until the end of this, you already know you're not here for surface-level news. You're here because you want to understand what's actually happening. Not just what, but why, and what it means for the world the rest of us have to live in. This channel is built on one thing: telling those stories without an agenda, without corporate backing, without sponsors deciding which parts of the truth are comfortable enough to share. If that means something to you, do 3 things right now. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Like this video, because it tells the algorithm that content like this deserves to be seen. And share it with one person who needs to understand what's happening in the world beyond the headlines. And if you want to go further, if you want to be part of something that lasts beyond any single news cycle, tap join. Every contribution, no matter the size, builds the foundation that keeps this going. The world doesn't slow down, neither do we.